I decided in this course that I wanted to begin at the beginning, so we're going to literally do that. We're going to talk about words and spacing. Now, why spacing and words? Because it's primarily the space that delineates a word. That's what makes a word, is the spaces around it. So we're going to talk about the spaces around words and the words themselves. In this, the first lecture in my basic writing skills section of my course. So let's begin with spacing. Now, the first thing that I already let out of the bag is that words are typically separated by a single space. Okay, don't put multiple spaces in there, put a single space. We're going to keep it clean from the beginning because remember, we are writing a manuscript that is intended to be published. So we're talking about keeping it clean for publication. Use single spaces between words, not multiples, not triples. Don't do any fancy spacing stuff using the space character. Use a single space character between words. When applying punctuation, here we go. This is how detailed we're going to get. When applying punctuation, the punctuation mark appears directly after the word and before a space character. So snug that punctuation up against the word. For instance, notice my when applying punctuation, where the comma occurs. It snugs up against the word punctuation and there's a space after it before the word the. There are exceptions. No space characters follow the last sentence in a paragraph. Don't clutter your document with a lot of extra space after the end of paragraphs. Keep it clean, no extra spaces. Instead, you'll insert a new line. Now notice that's not a space, that's a white space character, which is getting awful close, but no extra spaces. And then the other exception is that a space appears before the opening parentheses, as in this example. Notice it's not opening parentheses space, as in this example. We've snugged the parentheses over to the right instead of to the left and put a space before it. Now, the other area is that you can follow a sentence terminator, such as a period, a question mark, or an exclamation mark, with two spaces to separate sentences. Now, this is an old holdover that I still use because I learned how to type in junior high. Oh my gosh. Back in the 60s? Was it really that long ago? It was. I learned how to type in the 60s, the late 60s. But I learned how to type that, and the standard thing that you did was you typed a period on a typewriter, and then you would press space 2 times, and that's the way that you would delineate one sentence from another at the end. In recent times, that extra space characters become rather valuable, actually. You know, Kindle devices and other e-readers, you'll like to use as little space as possible. So I'm trying to wean myself off of the extra space. But just to give you a little bit of historical information, that's where editors such as Word and so on will not give you an error if you put a double space after a period, because it's an old holdover that a lot of people use. Now, to continue spacing, I want to talk about paragraphs. This is another area where you have some discretion and I have a preference. In this case, I'm not trying to convert from one to another. So paragraphs are typically delineated by indenting the first sentence a single tab character or 5 spaces, or by placing a blank line between the paragraphs. But you should never do both. I see in some cases some indie authors make the mistake of coming out with books where they use both a blank line and an indent. That's wasted space. Kindles don't have that much space on the screen, and that's where you're primarily publishing for. So what I prefer to do, and what takes up the least amount of space, is to just begin a new line with a paragraph and indent 5 spaces. Now, I have a style set up in Word to automatically do that for me, so when I hit a new line, it goes boing, pops over 5 spaces, and I'm going to show you how to do that when we get to the writing session. The next thing I want to talk to you about is separator characters. Now, these are asterisks. Like I like to use asterisk, space, asterisk, space, asterisk, or a single pound sign, and I use them to delineate new scene changes. This isn't quite strong enough to be a chapter break, but it changes maybe a point of view or something that describes a new scene. These are typically centered, as are chapter headings and titles. Sometimes I actually don't center my chapter headings or titles, but some people can, and these are the 2 cases in which you'll typically center something: an asterisk or a pound sign separator to delineate a scene, or chapter headings and titles. The other thing that I want to point out, and this is kind of the end of spacing for me, although we're going to get into lack of space next, is that 1-inch margins are usually used all around the page in a traditional page setup. It doesn't really matter because margins get thrown away on a Kindle, which is our primary publication device that we're concerned about. But in setting up page margins, actually, to tell you the truth, I use 0.75 just to get a little bit more space on CreateSpace, and you're going to find that out in my course. So there I break tradition, I'm sorry. But tradition says that 1-inch margins are standard. Now what I want to talk with you about is indenting and centering. I quite often indent and italicize quotes, as in this example. Life is hard, then you die. This is anonymous, and I use hyphen, which should have turned into an M dash before the word anonymous on the next line, and I italicize the whole thing and indent it 1 tab. I often quote this way. Okay, the next thing that I want to point out is that I always bold and rarely, but sometimes, center chapter titles. Once again, we're back to that sometimes. This is to your discretion. I usually leave them just left justified, but here we have an example of a bolded Chapter 1, The Martian Landing, which has been centered on this slide. So this is one case in which you might want to center, is with a chapter title. Now we're going to go back to words again instead of the spaces that separate them, where we're going to talk about capitalization. Capitalize the first word in every sentence. Now we've already done a little foreshadowing in the sense that we know that sentences are terminated with a period, a question mark, or an exclamation mark. Now we know that they begin with a capitalized word. So this is what delineates a sentence. Capitalize the first word, go through to the period, question mark, exclamation mark, and then optionally leave 1 or 2 spaces between it and the next sentence. That's what distinguishes a sentence. In addition, you should always capitalize proper names, such as the name of a person, place, or thing. Now notice this first example, mom. This is the way that you would capitalize it if it's a name, like mom, like that's your name, your mom. But if it's my mom, your mom, for instance, we're describing some mom, it's not the name mom, then it would be lowercase m-o-m. So if it's mom, I'm talking to mom, then it's uppercase m. If it's a mom, the mom, your mom, then it's lowercase m. I'm sorry to have dragged that out, but it's significant, and we're getting down to the details of the language. You need to learn this. Next is John Smith. Notice you capitalize both the first and the last name, and last is Chicago, the name of a town in the United States, and you should capitalize the name of town, so persons, places, or things. Next, capitalize the personal pronoun I. You never write a lowercase I when talking about yourself or writing in first person. You always capitalize the letter I. And then capitalize acronyms such as IBM for International Business Machines, CPA for Certified Public Accountant, and USA for the United States of America. Capitalize formal titles such as Dr., Mr., or Mrs., which I've abbreviated here by putting the period after them. I could have spelled out Dr. or Mr., M-I-S-T-E-R, and so on. But I chose the typical way of representing them, but still they're uppercase in this example. So uppercase formal titles. Now, the next thing I want to talk about is, once again, lack of space, when spaces disappear. First, hyphenation, I want to warn you about this. Hyphenation is quite often thrown in, seemingly at random, by modern word processors such as Word, to begin a word on one line and end it on the next. This is quite often used when doing full justification. And one of the reasons that I argue against doing full justification. You don't want the word processor to decide where to break your words from one line to the next. That's not a good use of hyphenation, so I'm going to show you when we get into the word session how to turn off auto hyphenation in Word. So don't use this form of hyphenation. Instead, use hyphenation to combine words into words that are properly formed using word phrases, such as from time to time. Time to time is hyphenated. It's one of those hyphenated words. When you hear words kind of string together and they sound like they're very connected, that's typically the time that they're hyphenated. All in all, devil may care, and nonetheless, these are more examples of hyphenated words. This is the place in which hyphens are valid to replace spaces between words when creating word phrases, not allowing your word processor to auto-hyphenate words to fully justify sentences. The next thing I'd like to talk with you about is contraction and possession. Now, both of these are achieved through the apostrophe, which removes a space, which is why we're talking about it in spacing. Let's take a look at it. You use an apostrophe to combine two words, as in, do not becomes don't, or D-O-N apostrophe T. Is not becomes isn't. Wasn't becomes was not becomes wasn't. Cannot becomes can't, and shall not becomes shan't. Notice there you don't even have the apostrophe. Now, the other case in which apostrophes is used is to indicate possession, as in Fred's book, the cat's toy, the boy's book, and the noted multiple exceptions to this rule like her world, our world, their world. None of these have the apostrophe in them, but they also indicate possession. Now, what do you do when you're using an apostrophe for possession and the word ends in an S? Do you do double S? Well, no, you actually don't. At least when using the style that I use. And that's the only thing that I can really teach you. So instead of Bess's book, it becomes Bess's book by just putting the apostrophe at the end of Bess. The same with the Kiss's Joy. You just put the apostrophe at the end of the S to indicate possession of kiss. A rather strange sentence. And that is contraction and possessions. Full justification, we've already talked about it. Don't do it. The random link spaces used to achieve it aren't worth any perceived benefit. And once again, you get those random hyphenations used to try and justify lines. Just don't do it. Instead, justify left and use a ragged right justification, or a ragged right margin is usually what it's known as. Foreign words and dialogue. As a final note, foreign words and dialogue are quite often highlighted in italic, as in Buenas noches, amigos, or goodbye, friends. And that's the end of this lecture. In the next lecture, we're going to go Actually, we're going to look at a writing example, and after that, we're going to go beyond words to punctuation. Wow. Neat. I'll see you then.